Why did China liberalize economically but not socially or politically? The short answer, and the simplest one that I can come up with, is because they didn't have to. Unlike the USSR, China wasn't isolated economically, so it could share in all the benefits of economic interdependence without having to fundamentally change its approach towards things like human rights or democracy. Western businesses jumped on the opportunity to economically integrate with China. They smelled blood. They smelled blood in the form of money. What's important to realize is that the way that the Chinese Communist Party views economics is not the same way that we in the West view economics. There is no difference between a political action and an economic action. There's no difference between a multinational corporation fundamentally and the state itself. China allowed multinational corporations to come in, and they also allowed for their own growth of businesses. But what they did not allow is for those businesses to have significant political power. All power has stayed consistently part of the Chinese Communist Party. The second that those businesses no longer serve the interests of the state, they're gone. Now, what do neoliberalists say? What is the argument now that economic liberalization did not lead to social liberalization or democratization? In fact, the argument could be made that instead of leading to political liberalization, what economic interdependence between the West and China led to was the growth in power of a totalitarian state that now rivals the West. Now, what G.J. Eikenberry, who is one of the leading scholars in the liberalist tradition, says in 2018 is that yes, the post-war international order is in crisis, but China is not engaged in a frontal attack on the American-led order. The argument that Eikenberry makes is that the liberal international order is what allowed for China's rise, so China will not do anything to fundamentally destabilize that order. Now, what this sidesteps is the basic fundamental problem. The argument that neoliberal economists were making was that this order will lead to social democracy. What we've actually seen is not that. Andreas Mulvad has a very interesting way of breaking down the different eras in Chinese political life after the Chinese Communist Party gains control of mainland China in 1949. It's Mao, Deng, and Xi. Those are the three main hegemonic projects that he identifies. One of the legs of Mulvad's theory is accumulation strategy. For Deng Xiaoping, the accumulation strategy is becoming the factory of the world, bringing manufacturing up to lay the groundwork for what Xi Jinping is doing now. And what Xi Jinping is doing now is that instead of saying we're going to integrate with the world, we're going to take a step back, now we're going to assert ourselves. We're going to reorder the liberal international order because now we can. We have achieved the goal that we set for ourselves, which was a political goal, not an economic goal. Now, the main story in 1989 and 1991 is the collapse of the Soviet Union. What's happening at the same time is that economic ties between the West and China are growing. This is pushed by Clinton, and this is pushed by Western neoliberal economic actors, such as Francis Fukuyama. Fukuyama argued in his famous article, The End of History, that even if China was still a totalitarian communist state, political liberalism has been following economic liberalism more slowly than many had hoped, but with seeming inevitability. Now, this line of neoliberal economic theory said that economically isolating countries doesn't work. If we don't normalize trade ties with communist totalitarian China, it's just going to push them further towards autocracy. This optimism was echoed in 1994 in an article by James Richardson, who stated that to treat China as an enemy today because of fears for the day after tomorrow could very well be a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's a smaller point to be made too. China was not seen as a threat the same way that Russia was seen as a threat. China was seen as an other. It was a non-Western country. China doesn't fit into a threat perception narrative that's ever worked within the United States or the West, at least within the last 100 years. People in the West just didn't know a lot about China, and they still don't. It's only within the last 10 years that the economic rise of China has been a salient news story. Instead of looking at what neoliberal actors outside of China have to say, if you go back and look at the actual talking points of the political leaders in China in the 70s, particularly Deng Xiaoping, and the other thought leaders who took control after the Gang of Four's demise, you see something very different. The quote-unquote period of opening, 1970 to 1973, where you have Richard Nixon fly to China, where you have him shake hands with Mao, a lot of this is couched in security terms, where the United States wanted to basically say, no, we are taking China's side in a fight against the Soviets. The CCP was adopting an economic angle very consciously. And this is something that a lot of Western thinkers and Western Okay, I'm gonna try to pronounce this. And this is from Sujian Guo and Baogang Guo. Waijiao Zhen Xin. But basically what that means is diplomatic battle line. And this was something that the Chinese Communist Party actively adopted in the 70s. It was diplomacy as a tactic of regime stability. But that's the 70s. What about Deng Xiaoping? What about the great opening up of the Chinese economy? What about all that? The Deng Xiaoping era, roughly the 1980s, is considered to be the era of China opening up to the West. What neoliberal economic thinkers such as Francis Fukuyama stated was that this opening up would lead to political reforms. That is, you liberalize your economy, you liberalize your country. That is, social rights will follow from economic prosperity. The problem with this is apparent if you go back to the writings and speeches of the supreme leader of the CCP at the time, Deng Xiaoping, who said, "We have made a solemn declaration that we will not employ a system of multiple parties holding offices in rotation, diversify our guiding thought, separate executive, legislative, and judicial powers, use a bicameral federal system, or carry out privatization." So the leader of the Chinese Communist Party says we are going to not liberalize socially. We are only going to liberalize economically. For whatever reason, the argument going was that they're not going to be able to stop this from happening. Liberal economics necessarily leads to liberal social rights and social values such as democracy, such as representative government. The Chinese Communist Party disagreed. And if you want an example of that, look at Tiananmen Square in 1989. You have what's considered to be this era of opening up, this era of flourishing, this era of economic interdependence between East and West, and then a bunch of college-educated young people generally with very pro-Western, pro-democracy, pro-liberal views get into a square, they occupy the square, they won't leave, they refuse to engage with the Communist Party as a legitimate political organization. And what does the Communist Party of China do? They send in the tanks. They kill somewhere between 100 to 1,000. The exact numbers are not totally known. Depends on who you ask, depends on casualty rates. But there's stories of people being run over by tanks. And this is in 1989. So then Francis Fukuyama, the article comes out the same year, and James Richardson's quote comes out 5 years after that. All of this economic integration comes in the wake of Tiananmen Square. It's easy to look back at these optimistic neoliberal economists and say, what were you thinking? Everything that they've said in their writings and in their political statements has said that they're not going to liberalize socially, that they're going to fight this liberalization tooth and claw. I think it's what businesses wanted to believe. I think it's what Western thought leaders wanted to be true. Because what felt the best for the 90s was we can allow unfettered businesses to run wild across the world and globalize however much they want to, engage with whatever kind of regime type they want to, and that will actually just be fine. That is actually going to just work out magically in the long run. If you play the game long enough, social liberalism will take place. But we don't live in that world. We don't live in an ideal world. We live in a world of tanks and steel and increasingly artificial intelligences and drones. So the fact that we armed a totalitarian communist state with as much power as they could ever need, and they're past the point where they ever need to actually integrate with us. Now, they've got all the technology, they're up to snuff. This is a very good reminder to be humble for your predictions for the future.